Great. We'll also go live on YouTube. Great. So, hello everyone. I hope you all are doing great. And welcome to the mega week of CA Monk, where we are going to be discussing a lot of topics. So, in today's session, we are going to be discussing that how you can get into the startups, how the startup works, and what the startups is all about, right? So, we have two panel of experts today who are going to be speaking on this topic today. So before we move into that, right? Before we move into that startup thing, right? Before we start our discussion, right? I want everyone to think of. I want everyone to think of before we move into that, right? So people from a Zoom, those who have connected with us, I'll again request you to turn on the videos so that we can have an interactive session around, right? Uh, so before we move into that, before we start the session, I want each and every one of you to think for 30 seconds. If I say a word startup, what comes to your mind? You can just use a chat box to write it down. You can just use the chat box to write it down. If I ask you, what is the one thing which comes to your mind when I talk about the startups? So I want everyone to use a chat box and write it down. What one thing that comes to your mind? Someone is mentioning Bangalore campus comes to my mind. Definitely. Bangalore is a hub for startups, right? Something innovative. Yogita is mentioning. People from a YouTube, you can use a chat box to write your thoughts. We want to know what are your thoughts on the startups. Great. ESOPs. Someone is mentioning ESOPs, right? Great. कुछ बड़ा करना है. Great prospect of growth of employees as well as organizations. Okay. All day work. Okay. Some innovations, enthusiasm and different mindsets. So I want everyone to think of, right? I want everyone to think of. सोचोगे तो नौकरी मिल जाएगी फटाक से, right? So I want everyone to think of high potential innovative ideas. Okay. Great. Great. I like the ESOPs one and the Bangalore one as well, right? Right. So many of you are expecting to get an ESOPs when you get into the startups, right? So let's start our discussion today. So today we have two panel of experts from Mishu, right? Vaibhav Todi has joined us and Karthik has joined us for the session, right? So in this session, we are going to be covering and talking more from a startup perspectives. How does a startup works? What is the work in a startup? What are the expectations that are there in a startup from a qualified chartered accountants? What are the roles and responsibilities that have been offered in the startups, and how you can get into the startups? More important, right? So all these questions we are going to be covering in this session. So I want you to listen this session very carefully, and those who have joined us, I'll again request you to share this link with your friends so that again they can benefit out of the session, right? So we have Karthik with us. So Karthik has been working as an associate director in a business finance in Misho. He has also worked in Aditya Birla Group, and he is also all India ranker 5 NCA finals. So great. So round of applause, and thanks Karthik for joining us for today's session. So I want everyone to give a round of applause to Karthik. Again, Vaibhav has joined us from Misho again. He's again working in Misho in a business finance role. So thanks Vaibhav and Karthik for joining us for today's session. So Vaibhav, I just want you to give our audience a thought view or a process, right? Since all of them are recently qualified chartered accountants, all of them are hunting for the job these days, right? So can you just tell your story, as in how you were able to get into the startups? What excited you to get into the startups, and uh, what is something which a student will be working on the startups journey? Yes, Vaibhav, please.
Hey, hi Shivam, hi everyone. So I think first of all, let me clarify, I'm not the expert. Karthik is one of the experts. I'm just like everyone else, trying to learn more about the startup world, just inquisitive about the startup world. As for my story, more about luck combined with being at the right time probably. at the right place. So right after my articleship, I was pretty sure that I was not, I was not very keen on working in the auditing field, nor was I very keen on working in the taxation department, which left actually very few avenues for a chartered accountant, especially other than cities like Delhi, Bombay. There are very few opportunities that are actually left for you. So kind of started trying out different roles, interviewed for several roles, even had offer letters for different teams. Even PwC. So PwC was supposed to be my backup in case I didn't get any other role to begin with. So right after that, so started interviewing for a couple of roles in FP&A, business finance, equities, uh, business valuation, and startups. Maybe I think it happened more by accident rather than by a conscious decision. So we used to have physical campuses, right? Pre-COVID times, we used to have proper physical campuses, and there, since I didn't want a audit job, what I used to do is I used to go there every day with my CV. And for that matter, since I was interested in startups, I used to carry two sets of CVs. One was for giving out to all auditing and folks in the industry, and the other was for the startup world. Few subtle changes here and there, just to make some sort of impression, because I didn't have a Big Four articleship, nor did I have any rank in CA final or IPCC that I could boast of. A couple of things for very simple and subtle things. For example, I did a project assignment back in my college days on the entire subject of network effects and how does it impact the new business environment, with a case example of Uber in India as well as New York. Uh, Quite an interesting case study by itself, but that also somewhat added value to the CV, that actually sets you apart from the rest of the people who would have a lot of audit experiences, finance experiences, and similar other work that they have done. Right. So other than that, also, I used to go out to all these conferences, seminars on startups and new emerging trends in the industry, new technology trends, etc. We used to have a lot of Toastmaster discussions, right? So that actually makes you stand out as somewhat, open and more open to actually talking it out rather than just working in a back office job. So I think Udan was one such company that had come to our campus, and it had shortlisted all rank holders and Big Fours. But then after a day of interviews, I think it got its list exhausted, and still it had to take a lot of other candidates, which it was not able to find in other campuses. So it opened up for everyone else that was present there. And fortunately, I seemed to be present there, and I made through all those rounds. So we had around 150, 200 of us right there in the Calcutta campus of ICI. So I was the one who got selected out of the other folks who were there after a lot of 4, 5 rounds, I think. So I think combined with the right amount of effort and putting in the right amount of mindset, it's also about being in the right place. And how do you be at the right place? But by just being in all the places you can possibly can. And especially, I think now with COVID situation out there, I think quite a lot of unconventional approaches become especially relevant, especially when you can cold mail people out, you can cold mail founders, you can actually approach people on LinkedIn and get inside a company. For example, I'm sure a lot of us might have seen there was this software engineer who got a job offer from Cred because he made a creative on Cred and posted it on LinkedIn and tagged Kunal Shah on that. So I think a lot of those unconventional things now come into play, but then it's all the same, right? You have to keep on trying and you have to upskill yourself as to what are the skills that are actually required to work in startups. And above that, I think you have to judge whether you want to work in a startup environment, because it is very different to what is there in the industry. And probably Karthik would be adding further since he has seen both sides of things. But then it both has its pros and cons, right? So it more or less boils down to whether you want to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond. Just to sum it up, but yeah, Karthik would have a lot of things to say about this.
Great, great, great. So, Karthik, are you available?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
here. I'm here.
Great, 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 great. So, hi Karthik. Okay, can you please also share your journey as an how you landed up into the startup, and uh, also some advices for the freshly qualified chartered accountants, that what are the perspectives that they should keep in mind when they are going for some of the startups.
Cool. So Vaibhav is much more, fresher to me and knows how to get his job in startup, right? Because he has cracked it. I want to ask
Right.
the newly qualified chartered accountants. By the way, congrats on your journey because you guys have kind of cracked most of the first exam, and this will give you the springboard for your future. Now, coming back to the topic, I want you guys to think not how to get into startup, but why you should get into startup, right? So, uh, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
So, I have seen both sides of the game, right? So, I was with a multinational company for close to 5, 6 years, post which I moved to a startup, which was pretty small when I joined, and now it is in the scaling stage. So, the skills and the learnings that you have in both of these sectors are very, very different, right? So, in a multinational company or even a bigger company, what really is required is a very good work ethic and your flexibility to work as per their processes. And the learning that you get is to learn from the best in class. What are the best in class processes? How different functions are run in a matured organizations, etc. In a startup, you are the owner. So any employee or any person who's joining a startup should have a founder mindset, which means that you should be ready to work in a chaotic environment, and the skill sets are different. So you have to be a good problem solver. You have to be a person who thinks on your toes, and you should have, you should be a solution oriented person, because as per me, every startup career is an optimization function, because you are going to work in an environment where there are constraints. So any startup career can be written like optimize X within constraints Y and Z. X can be anything. X can be your output metric. X can be your cost. X can be your revenue. X can be even a process. So if I give you some example, if you are in the business side of a startup or a business finance side of a startup, your objective is to increase customer engagement or increase revenue with the following constraints. Which might be a cost constraint, which might be a tech constraints, which can be even a organizational constraints. Similarly, if you are in a, say, controllership role or even investor relationship role, right, which is not entirely closer to the business, but there you have to optimize for the frequency, for the accuracy of the processes, given the constraints you have. So that is how it's different from a MNC or a startup. In an MNC, you are going into a well-set process, and you have to learn very quickly, adapt to the process, and deliver to your fullest. Whereas in a startup, you have to optimize. So you have the optimization mindset to do it. Now, coming to my journey, what I have learned in my MNC has helped. MNC kind of stint has helped a lot with startup. But what definitely helped me to grow is the same mindset where you are always, optimizing for the resource constraints that you have. And as I know, all of you guys aspire to be a CFO or a CXO. Ultimately, that is what you have to do, right? You have to keep on optimizing your business results given the constraints that you have,
Right.
right?
Great, great. So, Karthik, also, I wanted to add on as in, what was the major point of differentiation you felt when you switch your job from the corporates to the startup journey, and what was the major key learning points in the startup journey as compared to the MNCs?
Got it. So the biggest change that you'll get or that you feel when you move from a corporate setup to startup is a freedom to experiment. So you are free to experiment your solution. And if you fail fast and feel good, that is accepted. But if it succeeds, right, the learning that you get in a startup is like immense. So this freedom to experiment in a startup environment is the biggest X factor that you'll get in working in a startup. compared to a corporate setup.
Right, right, right. Great. So, Vaibhav, I want you to add on something regarding that. If see, many of are the students who are now going to be thinking of joining the startups and FP&A role, right? So you have joined the FP&A role as and when you got qualified, right? So can you also brief our students or the qualified folks regarding that? What sort of roles they would be working around as and when they are qualified, or what type of work they are going to be getting as and when they join the startups or an FP&A role?
for it. So first of all, when Karthi was talking about it, I was just reminded of a joke that we have amongst our friends. So whenever you get called to a interview, and especially in a startup one, so you are always asked that, why do you want to work in a startup, and why would you not want to work in a startup? Probably 101 point. So there was this guy who actually came to the interview and said that there's a lot of scope to try different things, especially at a young age, without permissions, right? Without taking a lot of permissions, you get a lot of freedom and get a lot of responsibility as an owner. So then he got asked that, what's the downside of it? And the guy said that सब फटा हुआ ही रहता है, कर लो आपको जो experiment करना है. How will you experiment in such a chaotic environment? So that is a trick of working in a startup. So that used to be the common poor joke around the corner. But coming back to this, I think especially from a fresher chartered accountant point of view, there are actually only two major branches that most chartered accountants would get accepted to. And probably later on in career, people also move to business. Like even in my past company and my current company, a lot of folks have, kind of transitioned from finance roles to actually business roles. For that matter, if you see Xiaomi's Redmi division, India head, and this was what Karthi was telling me a few days back, that she is also a chartered accountant who is leading the India business. Redmi is one of the biggest business for MI. So for that matter, you have two main divisions. One is controllership, wherein you work on the accounting side of things. It's more accounting heavy, and it's got to do more with keeping your books intact. There would be several sub branches in it. So depending on the size of the startup, you would be placed in probably an accounts receivable role or accounts payable role or working capital management or maybe the revenue side of things, wherein you would be managing journal entries, what sort of process gaps are required to be fixed on a priority basis. How should you establish cutoffs? How should accounting policies look like in such a fast changing environment when the business itself, kind of pivots every 3 months or probably every 6 months or even frequently. So those sort of roles would be grouped under controllership for that matter. The other part is business finance or FP&A. I don't think there is a clear definition demarcating FP&A from business finance in startups. You more or less have both of them combined, wherein you would have roles depending on what sort of startup is it. So coming to the common ones, if you're working in an e-commerce startup, you would typically have revenue side of business finance and you would have a cost side of business finance. And then you would have several other. So depending on your demand and supply funnels, you would have different business finance as a startup kind of grows. But more or less, if you see from a overall perspective, you will have revenue side where you'll be working on optimization of some of the key metrics and the key variables that actually help you increase your top line for that matter. So for most startups, GMV is kind of a very important number to track. Your gross merchandise value that is sold on a particular platform. How do you optimize for that? What are the various levers that are affecting that? And how do you increase basically conversions and transacting frequency of your existing cohorts, right? So that is overall revenue side of things. On the cost side, you will always have a lot of levers to pull, as in, because when a startup starts out, you do not have well-established process. There's a lot of leakages and there's a lot of, let's say, excess cost that has to be built to enable the startup to scale at a very fast level or to sprint at, let's say, 10x or 100x levels. So you will have different sub functions, or you will have the entire cost merged into a small business finance team, which will keep on then growing and branching out into several other sections. So if I have to sum up, you will have either controllership side of things or you will have business finance side of things. Business finance, again, you would be competing with MBAs again for this role. So it's a bit competitive and it's a bit tricky to get into. Controllership is more easy because you have almost 99% chartered accountants who are competing for that role. But more or less, you would have these two branches, which will again sub branch into all these roles that I have discussed about.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Great. So Karthik, I want you to add on regarding that, since you have been in a very senior position now and you do a lot of hirings in the companies as well. So what all skills that you would be looking into any freshly qualified chartered accountants when he or she is going to be applying for any of the startups? So any skills or any qualities which you would be focusing on the candidates when they're applying for the companies?
Right. So I want to add on to the point that Vaibhav was telling, right? So
Mhm.
in a business finance kind of a role, usually we are competing with MBAs. Now the biggest challenge as CAs face is that we are always trained to work within frameworks. So you have to work within the regulatory framework. You have to work within accounting standards. You are working with the auditing standards, right? Whereas in a startup, what really matters is your problem solving skills. It's how you structure your thoughts. It's how you take the problem, break down into multiple sub problems, and hypothesis the problem solutions and kind of test the solutions and implement it, right? So in any startup, for a CA, it is really, really important to demonstrate that your problem solving skills are super sharp. This is because in the industry, people take MBAs for granted because they are known to have these problem solving skills. Whereas for CAs, we have to demonstrate it explicitly because the usual, what the industry believes is that, CAs are not good problem solvers, but they are good compliance makers, right? So this is one change in direction that we have to develop ourselves since our curriculum is not supportive, unfortunately, right? Second, as I said, always every employee in a startup should have the co-founder attitude, right? Which means you have to be passionate about the purpose the startup is going to solve. It is not that, a simple question that you answer differently from, say, HUL to a startup, right? Why do you want a startup? When a person who is hiring you in a startup asks, he really wants to know why do you want to start the company. Because unless and until you resonate with the purpose or the problem that a startup is trying to solve, you cannot really contribute, right? So it is really clear to understand the space in which the startup is working, what kind of problem that startup is trying to solve, and how do you resonate to that problem, right? So these are the two factors that I always keep in mind while kind of gauging a freshly qualified chartered accountant or even chartered accountant point of view experience, right?
Right.
So usually we don't get into so much of technicalities or technical knowledge because that is like you have passed the exams, right? That is given, and it's more important for every new chartered accountant to build these skills through whatever resources available. It can be through peer learning, it can be through cohort-based learning courses, online courses, whatever it is. You have to build the skills to read an industry, to understand the sector. Also, how to structure your thoughts when you are approaching a problem, and how to kind of break down a problem to its very minute speed.
Right, right, right. Great. Vaibhav, you want to add on anything? Think. Oh, okay. No issues.
I think
Yeah.
Karthik has summed up pretty well. Yeah, so I was saying that I think Karthik has summed up pretty well that you have to have that mindset first of all to work in a startup because you will have a lot of different things than a corporate. Like for a corporate, you would not have a 9 to 6 job. Sometimes you would be required to stretch. Sometimes you would be required to just problem solve, work on the quality part rather than just the quality part of things. And which is something which is exactly opposite of what probably might be the trend which other corporates might be doing or other companies might be following. So it takes some amount of not just acumen, but also some amount of courage to actually try out different things and fail, right? Because not everyone is trained because we are always taught with that mindset that, this is the correct answer, this is the suggested answer, you're supposed to answer according to it and you have to stay within the boundaries of that. But I think startup just trains you to unlearn some of those stuff and do exactly the opposite of that.
Right. Great. So, Karthik, can you also tell our audiences regarding that if someone is so keen and willing to get into the startups, right? So, how they can get into the startups in terms of approaching to the people, or in terms of forwarding their CVs and stuff, right? Because many a times it has been seen that the startups doesn't come to the campus. Startups generally look for the folks uh, from the different mindset, right? So, because you being working into the startup, so can you also add on regarding this that what are the other things which a student should look into when they're getting when they're trying for the startups interviews? I think Karthik on mute. Yeah,
I will tell you from my experience, right?
yeah,
So the most important thing. So at the point of time in my life, I was very clear. I want to get into the startup space, and I want to get into a company which is yet to grow and have to see through the growth. Right. The important point is to the first step is to kind of you have to understand which are the sectors that kind of interest you. So the point is that you don't join a startup just for the coolness factor, right? It is not like everyone is joining a startup for the coolness factor. That is not the reason that you have to join. So there might be some sectors that you will kind of resonate with. There might be some sector that you don't want to get into. And first you identify those sectors and you start building, your knowledge on those sectors. Now, since startup doesn't come into campus, it's really, really important to leverage, platforms like LinkedIn, right? The really, what do you call it? The things that works is always, cold mailing or cold approaching, right? So even how I got into Misho is a different story because I cold message the CFO and we got in a discussion and it was something that, that worked out. Similarly, it is if you are in a city like Bangalore or Pune or even Mumbai, there are a lot of meetups and there are a lot of other offline events that might help you to connect to the startup folks. That is one excellent way of doing it. And if you are not in these cities, you're in other part of the countries, it's really, really important to leverage LinkedIn and other social networks like that. And you have to build your profile in such a way that it is not a resume, right? So the biggest mistake that people make while making a LinkedIn profile is that they treat it as a resume or a CV. So it is not a CV. So it is where you are exhibiting your interest, you're exhibiting your understanding of these sectors. And if you start to build your profile in such a way, and if you're even regular in your LinkedIn activity, the algorithm will push your profile up. And also by all these networking events and cold calling, cold connection, etc., you should be able to get into some. At least you'll be able to get into discussions. And startups usually the first two rounds are not interviews; there are pure discussions. It is where you go gauge whether this guy is fit culturally and whether he has understood the sector. And only in the last phase it gets into an interview. Right. So you have to keep in mind that you are approaching someone to have a discussion. As I said always, right? A startup employee is a co-founder. So initially you should have that discussion mindset. You should approach people without any hesitation. You start a conversation, structure a conversation, discuss about the company, discuss about the vision of the company, how do you resonate with it. Then you will be able to crack into other rounds or other levels.
right, right. So, Karthik, also I want you to add up regarding that. See, many of the students nowadays come to me stating that the startups are too cool. Startup is high perks, and startup has a very good culture around and stuff, right? And even I remember when I joined Udan, right? I the first question which I asked to the HR that do we supposed to wear a formal dress or not? So again, so lot of things changes when you get into the startup cultures, right? So how good it is from a freshly qualified chartered accountant's perspective to think in this terms, in terms of a money or in terms of the coolness, right? So is it good, or do you recommend the freshly qualified chartered accountant to focus on other aspects as well?
Right. So definitely, so it's individual opinion then. So initial years of your career, you should be focused on learning and learning alone. So what do you want to see in a startup? Of course, culture is something that you'll get to know once you interact with the people in the startup, right? So you have to first see how your future colleagues look like. right? That is where LinkedIn will help you again. So you'll be able to understand what are the kind of people who are working in the startup, because you're working with them, and it's like you're an average of the persons that you work with, right? So that is one important aspect that has helped me to decide to move to Nishu from other level, because I have found the people who are working here like super brilliant, right? Not just from pedigree point of view, even after talking to multiple people in the company before even getting the offer, I got to really understand what is the culture of the company, from not from an organizational culture, but also how how good the people are inside the company, and how do they how are they passionate about it. So these are the two aspects you have to keep in mind, and the others are peripheries, right? For example, the thing that you said, whether it's a formal or it's a casual, these are the things that doesn't really matter in the long run, right? So I so there is a, what do you call, it depends on what stage your startups are. So I will generally in the industry, startups are divided into 0 to 1 stage and 1 to 10 stage, right? In the 0 to 1 stage, basically you are trying to track a product and trying to create a market fit with your target addressable market. A 1 to 10 stage startup is where you have the PMF established, and the objective is to scale the startup and to make it a bigger company. In a 0 to 1 stage startup, the culture is always in a flux, because it's a really resource constrained environment. So there might be, the focus will not be in so much of processes or building and processing culture, etc. But what you have to clearly kind of gauge is that the startup's purpose and the values that they say is the value that there is, that they kind of inculcate in the organization, that you can understand by speaking to at least some of the people who are working in startups. So if you can have a comfort that the values that startup propagates is the value that startup works, then it is a very good uh, company to work with. And if you understand that the value that they say is entirely different from the value that is being practiced, then it's a red flag. So you don't need to, you have to probably think twice joining such kind of company. Now, when it is a 1 to 10 stage company, there the company will focus more on culture, and it will be a much better place to gauge how the company is currently, even from the secondary sources. You don't even need to really talk to the employees, but from the market, etc., you can understand how the startup works.
Right,
Right
right,
now, just to add one example, the value we should always uphold is speed over perfection, and that value is ingrained in each one of us. Everyone rallies behind that value. And that is where Misho works, because whatever value we say, now we have revised the value recently because we have moved to a 1 to 10x stage. But whatever values we kind of uh, give it out, everyone practices. That is one important quality to make sure the startup is in the right direction.
right. So let's open the forum for our students and the public around, those who have joined, right? So those who have doubts, I just want you to raise your hands so that we can cover your doubts as well. And the people from our YouTube, those who have connected with us, I want you to use a chat box so that you can post your questions in the chat box, right? So I think Adarsh, you have something to ask. Yes, Adarsh, please.
Yeah, if I work in a startup, will I get any exposure or learning about data analytics?
Vaibhav or
Because a
Karthik?
lot of
Yeah,
analysis of data is required, I think, in startup.
right.
Right. So short answer is initially no. But then if you have a knack for data analysis, analytics, or other forms of data mining or anything beyond that, you can obviously reach out, and that is one perk of a startup, that you can obviously reach out to particular teams and work with them on different projects not related to your profile. So for example, if you are, and especially if you are in smaller startups, you get more flexibility. As you move to larger startup, probably that flexibility gets narrowed down to a corporate level, where you don't get any such flexibility to work cross department. So it just depends on which size of startup you're picking and whether you are inquisitive enough to try that.
Right.
In fact,
But
something Karthik will also add, I think we as chartered accountants need to learn a lot of additional skills other than just finance. and including some amount of basic data querying, SQL, probably some amount of Python in the next 5 years. Otherwise, we would probably be shut down from the market.
So I'll add to that. I would say it all depends on, right? Because in a startup, you get all the tools to get good data analysis. It Nothing stops you, just you, right? And to be frank, I just want to add something here. It is more important to understand which data that you have instead of getting into analytics, right? So analytics is the part that that is something that you are gonna kind of help you to solve the problem. But what's important the step before that? What's important the step before is that you have to first hypothesize the solutions to your problem, or even identification of problem is a bigger task. So this is where initially your skills will be built in the startup, where you take a product statement, you try to dissect the problem, then you arrive at what all data I need to see this. Then you get to the analytics part. So I would say the initial, say 1 or 2 years, you will be honing your skills in the first part. Later, once you hone that skill, it's natural to you. Then that is where you can get into the analytics part, and nothing stops from you. You can become a data analyst or data scientist or whatever it is. Because what's going to happen is, even in case of data science, right? What's going to happen is that in future, so to be frank, in many of the current industries in India also, most of the models that is using data science models are a plug and play kind of thing. So as we kind of improve this discipline, a lot of plug and play models comes into this, and the biggest skill that is required is to understand which model to apply in this situation. That is where your business understanding comes into this. So initially, I would say the focus or the skills that you build is to break down a problem, understand the business deeply. Then once you have honed that skill, probably in first 1 or 2 years in a startup, that is where you can build on your data analytics skills. And if you are really persistent, in 3-4 years, you'll be very good data analyst / data scientist.
Right, right. Adarsh, I hope it suffices your answers. Any more questions you have to ask, Adarsh? Okay, okay, great. Someone is asking regarding the few of the interview questions. If anyone can tell, Web, if possible, you can just also focus us on few questions that a freshly qualified chartered accountant should prepare for interviews.
I think startups may most of first of all the initial rounds are more around discussions, as Karthik was saying. So they talk to you, they'll try to gauge your interest and whether you would be culturally fitting in. As for the technical round, I think one very understated skill is problem solving, and for that they'll test you on case studies. So they'll give you a case study, probably 5-10 minutes. They'll give you 5 minutes to think about it, write about it, and then they'll ask you to explain your answer using proper logics. And the trick there is that the answer itself is not important, right? You will always end up with a very wrong answer, but the interviewer is always trying to gauge as to what level or how deeply are you able to break that problem down, and how are you able to structure your thoughts around it, and how clearly are you able to articulate about it. So just to give you an example, I think probably in one of the interviews that I had given, so just in the Udan interview, that probably in the second or third round, I was asked how many mobile subscribers are there in India. A number. I have to quote that number without using internet. I was told that you have 5 minutes. Here's a notebook. Here's a notepad and pen. Just give me a number, and you have to explain how you arrive at that number. So by that, the interviewer just wanted to gauge as to how well I'm able to break down that problem. Am I able to structure it around ki, acha, population is this much, what percentage would be in cities, what percentage of people would be literate, what percentage would be in which age group, accordingly take some assumptions around it, calculate and do everything and come up with an answer, which is obviously not coming anywhere close to the correct answer, but how well I'm able to break down that problem and consolidate it into a proper structured answer is what these guys usually try. But I think Karthik has his own set of secret questions. We won't tell.
Karthik, if possible, can we get some questions out of the secret point if possible?
I don't have a fixed recipe as such,
Okay.
but mostly I test on go-to-market strategy. So it is similar to how you structure your thoughts, right? So one, I would say, template question that I ask is, how do you gauge the size of the market for a fashion retail company? So that is basically, it might be a particular region. I would be asking for West Bengal or any of the states, right? Just to understand how detailed the candidate can think about this. As Vaibhav was saying, right? When you say about fashion retail market, you have to think. So basically, think from the population set that we are going to target. Right? It changes from state to state, right? Might be something in West Bengal, might be something in Bihar, something, right? So that is the, I would say, the recipe question that will go, because that will help you understand how broad this person can think. And if a person can think so broadly from an industry perspective, then he would be a very good fit in a startup, because you have to always go beyond finance, and you cannot have a tunnel vision in a startup.
Hmm. Right, right, right.
Right. So to answer this question summarily, in startup, very rarely you'll get a technical question. And I don't think why initially anyone should ask this question, even if someone is asking for it. And it's more about demonstrating your problem solving skills and your thought structuring. And just a word of, not an advice, I would say from my experience, you have to start writing in your notebook or somewhere, because writing helps you to structure your thoughts. So even if just to read yourself, any random topic you can pick and you can start writing about it, which actually helps you to sharpen the way you structure your thoughts. So when I moved from, so I was in Aditya Birla Group for like 6 years, right? Initially, I was in a FP&A role in Idea Cellular. Then I moved to chairman's office. So when I moved to chairman's office, that's where I struggled, because you get what, 2 minutes, 3 minutes with the senior leadership, with the chairman, and you have to prove your point within that time, where your structuring of thoughts is very, very critical. And that's where I realized I started writing down all my thoughts before I meet him or for my meeting with the senior leaders, where it actually helped me to structure my thoughts. And as I kind of practice this, it becomes natural to me how to structure thoughts and kind of
Right, right, right. Great. So before we conclude, as in, we want to know any pro advice or any pro tip which you wanted to give to any freshly qualified chartered accountant, Karthik.
Sure. Right. So first thing I want to just this is something I have seen in all freshly qualified startup accountants, is that no one wants to get into controllership field. And to some extent, people are kind of looked down to the controllership field, right? But I would say in the initial 2 to 3 years, any role you pick up in any company, whether it's startup or MNC, there will be immense learning, right? And once your learning tapers off, that is where you should look for a role change. So initially, unless you are really clear on what to do, I would not say the role really matters. But what really matters is the sector. You have to choose a sector in which you like to work and you resonate with. That is really important. Roles will, even if you are not in a role that you really want to, it can change if you get different roles, etc. Unless you want to be a specialist, like a taxation specialist, or something like that sort. So that is one thing. No, don't be so clinky about a particular role, but choose a sector really, really nice, right? And that is a general, what do you call, general advice. Now, while choosing a startup, do your research properly, do your due diligence properly, understand what is the problem the startup is trying to solve, and understand yourself what is the target risk market, or as we call TAM. The TAM should be really huge. Now, the problem should be really huge the startup is trying to solve. Similarly, do due diligence by reaching out to the employees who are already working there. You can use secondary research methods. You can use Glassdoor. You can use LinkedIn. You can use a lot of tools. So leverage all these tools and make sure you understand the business thoroughly and what they're trying to solve. And you should resonate with the company vision. Right. I
Right.
think these two things is what I want to point out.
Great, great, great. Vaibhav, any sort of advice which you wanted to give to freshly qualified chartered accountants?
I think other than this, especially when cold calling or reaching out to people on social network like LinkedIn, I think it's very important that, especially from fresher chartered accountant's point of view, that you do your due research on the person and you don't send him a generic message. So, while I have also received a lot of such messages, and whenever we do some job posting or I put out some job update, I get hundreds of CVs saying that either on mails I would get, please find attached, full stop. That's it. I don't know the guy. Or LinkedIn pay, the guy will be asking, hi, do you have a vacancy? Here's my CV. So when you're reaching out to someone, do assume that there will be at least 100, 200 of other people who would also be reaching out. And the other person might not have the bandwidth to actually screen one by one each of the candidates, especially when they don't know you or you're not coming from any particular reference. So for that matter, you have to be a little more sharp in your research about the other person, about the company for that matter. You can read about a lot of startups in media or probably in Glassdoor, or probably you get a lot of articles these days on news websites like Ken, Morning Context. Read about it, and probably you can frame it more towards understanding that startup better and then applying towards that particular startup rather than just a plain generic message that please find attached my CV.
Right, right. Great, great. Yeah, really, really good to see that the lot of advices for the freshly qualified chartered accountants, and I hope that we try to resolve all your doubts which everyone had. Right. So before we conclude, I just want to thank Vaibhav and Karthik for their valuable time for joining us for the session, and also request everyone to please turn on the video so that we can have a group photo as a memory. Right. And definitely we are gonna be sharing you after 5 years down the line that you joined this session. So I'll also request everyone to please turn on the videos. People from YouTube, if you have any doubts, please do post it on the comment section so that we can help you out to resolve those doubts. Great. Vaibhav, Vipin, please, if possible, turn on the video so that